Imagine that your country was suddenly brutally invaded and your fellow countrymen held captive. Imagine then your people are slowly and systematically tortured and killed. And imagine you are the one placed in charge of those people and are solely responsible for their destiny. What would you do? Would you fight and die a swift, heroic death? Or would you negotiate and attempt to keep your people alive as long as humanly possible?
Deutschland in stolzer Freude!
That was the terrifying dilemma facing this man, Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski ran one of the biggest Jewish ghettos in Poland during World War II. Time and again, he was asked to hand over his own people for deportation to the death camps. But Rumkowski believed that by cooperating with the Germans, he might be able to save at least some of his people. But did that make him a fall guy for the Nazis? Was he a collaborator? A Jew who betrayed his fellow Jews? Or was he a skillful negotiator, doing his best for his people?
Anyone who was holding that post would have to do what the German wanted him to do. There was no other option. Anybody who was held that position would have to do it. Unless you decided to commit suicide yourself and you say, no, I'm not doing it. That was the only alternative he could do.
In Poland in the 1930s, the city of Łódź had one of the biggest Jewish communities in Europe. One of its leading citizens was Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski. Born in Russia, he was already an old man as the prospect of a Second World War grew closer. By the late 1930s, he had become the director of the largest orphanage in the city. It was considered one of the best and most enlightened in Poland. At that time, Rumkowski was a prominent Jew in a country that was notorious for its anti-Semitic feelings that were rarely far from the surface. He'd managed to negotiate the best deal for his orphanage, and it was a skill that he thought he could use for a new challenge that would be the greatest of his life. On September the 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. It was the beginning of World War II. The German army moved with ruthless speed and efficiency. Polish resistance crumbled. Within weeks, the entire country had been overwhelmed. The German frontline troops were soon followed by SS death squads sent in to kill and expel so-called undesirables. Poland's large Jewish communities felt the effects immediately. Jewish cultural and social institutions were abolished. Jewish intellectuals and political leaders were rounded up and shot at random. The entire western half of Poland had been earmarked for annexation to Greater Germany. The plan was to kick out Jews, Gypsies, and the Poles to make way for new German settlers. Just a week after the invasion of Poland, the Nazis stormed into Rumkowski's hometown of Łódź. They were greeted by fanatical crowds of so-called Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans who lived outside their mother country, overwhelmed by the sight of the Nazis taking over their city. For the Jewish population of Łódź, it was a very different story. Attacks on them by the Nazis began almost immediately. The 4 main synagogues were burnt to the ground. Those Jews who could get out of the city did. But despite their overwhelming might, the Germans soon realized they had a problem in Łódź. There were simply too many Jews to be dealt with in the short term. The Nazis' solution to the problem was simple. If they couldn't expel the Jews, then they would be cleared out of the city and confined to a smaller, more manageable area on the outskirts. In the early months of 1940, the Jews of Łódź were violently evicted from their homes and moved to a slum area of the city's old town. By April 30th, 1940, the ghetto was surrounded by barbed wire and sealed off. Jews were forbidden to leave, outsiders were forbidden to enter. It was the first major Jewish ghetto of World War II. Helen Aronson is 84 and lives on her own in a quiet and secluded part of the country, just north of London. But she grew up close to the city of Łódź in Poland. When war broke out, she was just 12 years old. As a member of a Jewish family who lived near the city, she was one of many who was rounded up by the Nazis and locked in the city's Jewish ghetto.
It was a Saturday, it was a beautiful day. I believe there might have been about 8,000 Jewish people. The Polish Christian population were watching us. Nobody said anything. They were just watching and we were walking. Walking. I held on to my mother and my brother. There were German soldiers with dogs. We just didn't know what is going to happen. After about an hour or so, we eventually arrived to Łódź Ghetto.
The Nazis wanted the day-to-day running of the ghetto to be taken care of by the Jews themselves. It was a convenient way to avoid tying up German manpower. The plan was to appoint one of the town's leading Jewish citizens to be the Nazis' main point of contact. The man they chose for the job as the Jewish leader of the ghetto was Chaim Rumkowski.
Well, he looked like a sort of grandfather. I mean, he was quite old. He was always very nice towards me. And whatever I asked him to do, sometimes for my mother or for my brother or whatever, he did it. It was enough to be seen with him that you were somebody because his powers were so great, like the Queen of England.
Once installed, Rumkowski was expected to establish his own Jewish council, a group of prominent Jews who would run the ghetto's affairs. They had responsibility for providing work, food, housing, and health services. It was a monumental task. The population of the ghetto when it was first established was almost 250,000. But why did the Nazis come to choose Chaim Rumkowski as their man to run the ghetto? His appearance may well have helped. He simply didn't look Jewish. He was perhaps the sort of Jew the Germans felt comfortable with. He was clean-shaven, with piercing blue eyes. Rumkowski also had experience of dealing with anti-Semitic authorities. But his new position as the head of Łódź Ghetto presented him with a terrible dilemma. Just how do you deal with an all-powerful enemy, hell-bent on the destruction of your people? If he failed to cooperate, the Germans would simply annihilate the Jewish population. But if he cooperated, he risked being labeled as a Nazi collaborator. It was a dilemma many Jewish leaders would face in the years to come. But none would be as controversial as Chaim Rumkowski. The conditions in the ghetto provided a severe test of Rumkowski's organizational abilities. What he'd inherited was like a living hell.
The families were cramped in, for instance, 10, 12 people could live in one room. People, you saw walking people in the streets who were real skeletons, and some of them just died there and then. There were people collecting the dead bodies. I mean, it was so difficult really to describe the conditions there, the illnesses there, the absolutely terrible, terrible conditions. New arrivals used to arrive, people from various parts of Europe, Czechoslovakia and Germany. They were told they're going for a holiday. People used to arrive in beautiful clothes, ladies in fur coats and hats and handbags, and suddenly they were faced with this place with walking skeletons and dying people in the street and no food at all and terrible conditions. And I'm afraid that these people, because they were not so resilient, were dying very, very quickly. I feel that because of Rumkowski, who, when we were in the ghetto, he helped us in any way he could.
Although pledging his help to those inside the ghetto, the problem Rumkowski faced was that the Germans had made it quite clear they had no interest in keeping the Jews alive. A German SS commander in Łódź, Friedrich Ubelhor, had written a memorandum shortly after the invasion of Poland.
It is obvious that the establishment of the ghetto is only a temporary measure. I reserve for myself the decision as to when and how the city of Łódź will be cleansed of Jews. In any case, the final aim must be to burn out entirely this pestilent abscess.
If the Jews of Łódź were to have any chance of surviving, Rumkowski desperately needed a plan. With almost 250,000 people confined to a small area with no farmland, provision of food very quickly became the most pressing problem. The Nazi commanders insisted that the ghetto pay for its own upkeep. But how could Jews who were locked away from the rest of society and who had been stripped of all valuables make enough money to pay for food and housing? Rumkowski's plan was to agree to every German demand on the grounds that if he didn't, the Germans would simply impose it, but with much greater bloodshed and brutality. And Rumkowski did have one major bargaining chip. He could tap into what he called a gold currency of the highest caliber, that is, the labor of Jewish hands. He set out to turn the ghetto into a huge work camp. Rumkowski wanted to make it indispensable, a cheap and lucrative source of supplies for the Nazi war machine. Rumkowski's next step was to outline his plan in a letter to Hans Biebow, the German official in charge of relations with the ghetto.
There are in the ghetto 20,000 skilled workers. I could organize matters so that work would be done inside the ghetto, and the workers would turn the finished product over to the authorities. In this way, I hope I and my department will be permitted to balance the ghetto budget, support the poor and needy, protect the population from disease, and take care of all the other needs of the ghetto's Jewish inhabitants.
His plan worked. Biebow was sympathetic to Rumkowski's suggestion. A cheap and controllable source of goods would not only help the German war machine, it might even further his own career. Rumkowski now began to put his master plan into action. During late 1940, new factories were set up in the ghetto. They included tailors, shoemakers, carpentry workshops, and metalworks. The ghetto's biggest customer was the German military, which was supplied with uniforms, boots, backpacks, and even munitions. The Nazi High Command even appeared to give it their blessing. In 1941, SS Commander Heinrich Himmler inspected the ghetto. His conversation with Rumkowski was recorded by one of the inmates in his diary.
"How are you doing here?" asked Himmler. "Not badly, I think. I'm doing everything so that the ghetto will work more and work better. My motto is work, peace and order. Then go on working for the benefit of your brethren in the ghetto, retorted Himmler. It will do you good.
And Rumkowski's achievements didn't end there. In his position as head of the ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski was effectively given a free hand to run it the way he wanted. He now set out to create what he believed would become a Jewish mini-state. He established a housing department to cope with chronic overcrowding and a welfare system to distribute relief to the needy. Conditions in Łódź were becoming better than in many other Jewish ghettos. Helen Aronson was a young girl in the ghetto, and the improvements were becoming apparent.
This ghetto, this Łódź ghetto, was like a Jewish country. We had doctors, we had hospitals, we had police, we had entertainment, we had hairdressers, we had everything you can think of, and work. And the goods that were made and manufactured in that ghetto, it was amazing things that were made.
Rumkowski managed to set up schools in the ghetto, the only one in Poland to have them. He even managed to establish a Jewish cultural center and religious services. When the Germans outlawed rabbis, Rumkowski conducted marriage ceremonies himself. But Rumkowski's master plan was about to face a shattering blow. When Rumkowski had negotiated his pact with the Germans to sell the products of the ghetto for food, there had been no mention of price. He now found the Nazis held all the cards. They controlled the price of the raw materials brought into the ghetto, and they controlled the quantity of food that was given to the Jews in exchange. Rumkowski had assumed the Germans would behave rationally. If the ghetto was productive, he believed the German authorities would have a vested interest in keeping it going. But he'd failed to grasp that for the Nazis, killing Jews was more important than economic gain. The Germans made sure the food supply was never enough, and what food did arrive was often spoiled. Rumkowski himself imposed food rationing to make it stretch, but it often fell below subsistence level. For all his efforts, increasing numbers of the ghetto's residents died of starvation.
The rations were so small. I know families, friends of mine, that piece of bread or whatever they got for the week, they used to lock it. Everyone had their lock and key because people were stealing from each other. People say, oh, now how could they do it? How could they do this and the other, and one against the other? But the circumstances were not normal, and everyone wants to live.
For Rumkowski, problems were starting to mount. As productivity in the Łódź ghetto increased, and the Jewish population were being asked to work harder and harder, the workers began to organize strikes and demonstrations against the harsh conditions. Rumkowski's authority and strategy depended on buying German cooperation with a constant supply of cheap goods. If he allowed the strikes to continue, the Germans would cut the food supply even further. He argued that the strikes and demonstrations threatened the very survival of the ghetto. At one workers' rally, he announced, "Strikers are criminals. I'll act like a dictator. I'll stamp them out, them and their families. I'll arrest them and send them to labor camps." But opposition continued. Slogans appeared such as "Kill Rumkowski" and "Open the ghetto." In response, Rumkowski became increasingly dictatorial. He sent in the ghetto's police to put down his critics. He used his control of the food supply to impose his will further. Those who agreed to work ate. Those who didn't were left to starve. He went on to tell the strikers, "My motto is work, something that could keep us alive. And you didn't want to build, but to disrupt. In order to save the ghetto, I am forced to act decisively, like a surgeon who cuts off a limb so the heart won't stop beating." But were these the words of a man in terrible circumstances doing his best for his people? Or was it the first signs of someone desperate to cling on to power? There were certainly clues that he was beginning to enjoy the trappings of office. Rumkowski now began to refer to his headquarters as the Chancellery, copying the German example. People were encouraged to pray for his health as if he were a king. And the ghetto newspaper printed poems celebrating his achievements. More damagingly, it was said he and the other council members were living well, while everybody else starved. For many of the Jews in Łódź, Rumkowski was no longer a savior. He was a self-serving collaborator. He showed favoritism to those residents that he liked or were close to him. Helen Aronson was one of the luckier ones in the ghetto.
Well, he had the courage and guards with him, and it was, and he used to visit various factories and places, and his main office and so on. He asked me to go in the carriage with him, go back to Marysin, to the orphanage, and I felt like, with the Queen of England. I mean, it was something being seen with him that was already sort of like a passport to a better life. That's how great his power was.
Then there was a development that would put his apparent pact with the Nazis in an even starker light. In January 1942, the Nazi leadership met here at Wannsee, in the suburbs of Berlin. They gathered to debate what was termed the final solution to the Jewish problem. What exactly was to be the fate of the millions of Jews that the Nazis had rounded up and imprisoned? Leaving them to starve in the ghettos was a slow, inefficient, and impractical solution. Hitler needed a quicker, more effective method. At the Wannsee conference, the decision was taken to set up a series of camps where Europe's Jews would be systematically exterminated. The first signs of the new policy reached the Jews in Łódź almost immediately. Just weeks after the Wannsee meeting, Rumkowski was ordered to assist the German authorities in arranging what was referred to as the resettlement of 20,000 of the ghetto's Jews. They were told they were being sent to labor camps further east, Rumkowski negotiated with the German leadership in Łódź to halve the number of Jews that were to be sent away. But in the long run, it made little difference. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, one deportation followed another. Thousands and thousands of the ghetto's Jews were simply rounded up, taken to a nearby train depot, and forced into goods wagons. At this stage, those in the ghetto had no idea of the fate that awaited their friends and family who were being taken away.
We knew there was such place like Auschwitz. But what actually happens there, we didn't know. Sometimes people left little bits of papers in the wagons to say, don't follow us. But we really did not know, really, what is happening there. We had no idea.
Where did you think all these people were being sent?
To work, somewhere to work in Germany. That's what we were sort of told, that we're going to work in Germany.
In the summer of 1942, signs began to appear that Rumkowski's popularity was beginning to slide even further. There were rumors that he was using the deportations to rid himself of his opponents. In early September, the Germans, assisted by Rumkowski's ghetto police, began to get rid of anyone who was thought to be a drain on the ghetto's resources. They cleared out the hospitals. 2,000 patients, including 400 children, were deported. It was a brutal and bloody affair. Seemingly unaware of the Nazis' new policy of exterminating the Jews, Rumkowski continued to insist the long-term interests of the majority were best served by sacrificing the minority. But was he really ignorant of what was going on? Huge numbers of Jews were being deported during that summer of 1942. In Warsaw, 300,000 were sent to the concentration camps. At the same time, 50,000 Jews were sent from the Łódź ghetto. Some believe Rumkowski must have known the terrible fate that awaited his people.
I think so. I think so by that. I think so. I think so. Well, nobody came back from all these transport that were sent, and I'm sure that he knew what was happening in Auschwitz. I'm sure he knew.
Even in the near-total isolation of the ghetto, there were clues for those willing to read them. During 1942, large shipments of baggage had been arriving in the ghetto. The diary of one resident records,
The bundles contain clothing that has been disinfected. Nearly all the jackets bear traces of having been cut along the seams. Documents from all over Europe are in the bundles, and some show that the papers were drawn up in this ghetto.
Here was evidence that those who'd been deported were not coming back. Their clothing and possessions were merely being recycled by the Germans. Then, in September 1942, the Nazis made a new demand. It was more distressing than anything that had gone before. That month, the Germans demanded that every Jewish child in the ghetto under 10 and every adult over 65 must be handed over for deportation. Even though Rumkowski had worked closely with children running the main orphanage in Łódź, he still cooperated. He then made one of the most appalling and dramatic speeches of World War II. From the language he uses, it seems clear that Rumkowski knew what the fate of the children and the elderly would be. A grievous blow has struck the ghetto. They are asking us to give up the best we possess, the children and the elderly. I never imagined I would be forced to deliver this sacrifice to the altar with my own hands. In my old age, I must stretch out my hands and beg, brothers and sisters, hand them over to me. Fathers and mothers, give me your children. When Rumkowski made this speech, Helen Aronson was 15. She was a useful worker in the ghetto and was one of those favored by Rumkowski. She remembers his infamous speech.
How can you ask parents to give away the children? It is most difficult task. I mean, I don't know how he could do it, quite frankly. Maybe it would be better if they just came and took the children without the speech, because it must have been really, really difficult for the parents who had to do it. How can you do that? To send these kids to be gassed, to be slaughtered. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he did it.
So did Rumkowski have a choice? He certainly wasn't the only Jewish leader facing such unthinkable situations. Other leaders across Poland faced similar demands, but some of them responded very differently. In Warsaw, the leader of the Jewish ghetto, Adam Cherniakov, was told to round up 6,000 people a day and hand them over to the Germans. The lists included thousands of children. For 2 years, Cherniakov, just like Rumkowski, had chosen to cooperate with the Nazis. But when the deportations began, and it became clear his people were being sent to certain death, he couldn't take it any longer. On July the 23rd, 1942, Cherniakov took a capsule of cyanide and killed himself. He left a note to his wife that read,
"They demand me to kill children of my nation with my own hands. I have nothing to do but to die. I can no longer bear all this. My act will prove to everyone what is the right thing to do."
It was a very different response to Rumkowski's.
The United Nations have bridged the English Channel on June the 6th, 1944, a date indelibly written in the annals of history by the armed forces of the free world. The fighting men of Britain, the Empire, and America embarked on the greatest amphibious operation ever undertaken.
In the summer of 1944, the tide of the war turned decisively against the Germans. It became clear that Hitler's forces would soon be trapped in a pincer movement as the Allied invasion made its way from the west and the Russian army pressed on from the east. Meanwhile, Himmler now ordered the final liquidation of the Łódź ghetto. It had become the largest concentration of Jews in German-occupied Europe. Once again, Rumkowski cooperated. In August 1944, he told the people of the ghetto, "Jews of the ghetto, come to your senses. Volunteer for the transports." As the remaining Jews were herded out of the ghetto, the German authorities made 750 of them stay behind. Hanging on to her privileged position in the ghetto, Helen Aronson was one of that group.
The reason why we were left in the ghetto was to clean out all the houses and flats of the people who used to live there and take all the possessions and segregate them so that they all can be useful and be sent to Germany. For instance, bedding, linen, crockery, cutlery, furniture, clothing, and everything bring out into the streets in a pile. Afterwards, lorries used to arrive and collect all these things, and everything was taken to Germany and made into money. And that was our job to do, and that's why we were left behind to do this work. All of us had some poison with us, and we knew that we are here for a short time to do a job for them, for the German government, and when we finish the job, our fate will be exactly the same as all the others. We follow all the others, and we thought when the worst comes to the worst, we know what to do.
The clean-up operation of the ghetto went on into January 1945. And then finally, salvation arrived. The Russians had advanced quickly and were now on the outskirts of the city. Fearing for their lives at the hands of the Germans, Helen and her family hid in the cellar of one of the houses in the ghetto.
We stayed in that place for quite a few days. We could not survive for a long time there because we had no facilities and not much air. Every so often, my brother very anxiously opened that little floorboard to look out. We couldn't see anything, we couldn't hear anything, all quiet. And then, one day, we heard a lot of stamping above us. And my mother suddenly said, "I think I can hear some Russian spoken." Russian? She must be crazy. We opened our place, and then I came face to face with the Russian soldier. And he said to me, "The war is finished and you are free." This was taken in January 1945, when I was liberated in the camp, showing this group of people and one man playing accordion. He was my boyfriend, and my daughter looked at the picture and said, "But Mommy, you're sitting next to him." Well, at that point, I just cried, laughed. I just didn't know how to react, and I did both. It was most unusual that to find yourself in a book after 60 years.
But what of Chaim Rumkowski? Some historians believe that he and his wife volunteered for resettlement and boarded a train bound for Auschwitz with others from the ghetto. One eyewitness described Rumkowski's arrival.
Rumkowski didn't know what was happening. He turned to me and asked, "What goes on here? Can't you smell? Can't you see the fire?" I replied, anger and revenge in my voice for what he'd done to my friends. "Where am I?" he asks. "Auschwitz." "Oh my God," he says, smacking his forehead with his palm.
But was that really his fate? Was he gassed at Auschwitz? There is, however, another possibility.
I heard that he was sent with all his family. That was the last transport going from Łódź ghetto to Auschwitz. And I'm not quite sure, but the rumors were that he was actually killed by the Jews and not when he arrived there, and not by the German. But I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know.
So what are we to make of a man who willingly sent his own people to the Nazi concentration camps? Clearly, many view Rumkowski as a collaborator. But it's not a simple picture. Łódź was not just the best-run ghetto, it was also the longest surviving. And even though the numbers are small, 750 people survived. Some of those put that survival down to one thing: the fact that Rumkowski managed to keep them in the ghetto for so long.
I don't think him as a collaborator. Anyone who was holding that post would have to do what the German wanted him to do. There was no other option, because if he didn't do it, if he didn't deliver the people, the German would come into the ghetto and do it themselves. There was no other option. Anybody who held that position would have to do it, unless you decided to commit suicide yourself and you say, no, I'm not doing it. That was the only alternative he could do. But would it help the people? I don't think so.